The scent of money and power hung thick in the private dining room, like expensive cologne mixed with barely concealed violence. Gene Woozing sat at the head of the lacquered table, his presence commanding absolute attention from the 6 men who had traveled across 3 countries to sit in his shadow. The restaurant, Soul Garden, was his territory, every server trained to disappear into the walls when certain conversations required complete privacy. Amara Williams balanced the crystal whiskey glasses on her silver tray with practiced precision, her movements fluid despite the tension that crackled through the air like electricity before a storm. She had served enough private parties in her 2 years at Soul Garden to recognize the particular stillness that meant serious business was being conducted. The kind of business that paid her rent and her brother Marcus's college tuition, no questions asked. "Where are you watching from tonight?" She wondered silently as she approached the table, thinking of all the people across different states and countries who might understand what it meant to work in spaces where power moved like a living thing. The weight of responsibility pressed against her shoulders as she set down each glass with the quiet efficiency that had made her indispensable to the restaurant's most exclusive clientele. Jin's dark eyes tracked her movement with the calculated attention of a predator assessing his environment. Even seated, his authority filled the room completely. His charcoal suit was cut with military precision, every line emphasizing the controlled danger that made grown men defer to his slightest gesture. When he spoke, his voice carried the particular cadence of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The meeting concerned territory disputes in the shipping district, words flowing in rapid Korean punctuated by occasional English when specifics demanded clarity. Amara understood enough to know that millions of dollars and several lives hung in the balance of whatever decision Jean would render. She had learned to make herself invisible during such discussions, but her trained ear caught the undercurrent of desperation in one man's voice as he pleaded his case. That desperation should have been her first warning. The explosion of splintering would announce the attack before the gunfire erupted. The restaurant's main door disintegrated under the force of tactical entry as masked men poured through the opening like black water. Automatic weapons chattered their deadly rhythm, transforming the elegant dining space into a battlefield in seconds. Jean moved with lethal grace, his hand finding the pistol concealed beneath his jacket in one fluid motion. 2 controlled shots dropped the first attacker before the man could fully clear the doorway. But there were too many of them, and they had planned this ambush with the precision of military strategists. Time fractured into crystalline moments of violence and terror. Jin's men returned fire while diving for cover behind overturned tables, their expensive suits providing no protection against the hail of bullets that shredded everything in the room. The air filled with gunpowder smoke and the acrid smell of splintered wood and shattered crystal. Amara dropped her tray and pressed herself against the wall, her nursing school training screaming at her to assess, prioritize, act. She watched Jean advance methodically through the chaos, his movements controlled despite the blood spreading across his white shirt from at least 2 bullet wounds. He was protecting his men, drawing enemy fire toward himself with calculated courage that bordered on suicidal. The 3rd bullet caught him center mass, spinning him against the wine cabinet with bone-jarring force. The 4th opened a gash along his temple that painted his face with crimson. As he collapsed, his gun sliding across polished hardwood beyond reach, the remaining attackers closed in for the kill. Something primal and protective surged through Amara's chest, overriding every survival instinct that screamed at her to run. She launched herself forward, her body covering Jin's fallen form as bullets whined overhead. Her hands found the pressure points where his life leaked out in steady pulses, her fingers applying the compression techniques that had been drilled into her during endless hospital rotations. "Stay with me," she whispered against his ear, feeling his breathing grow shallow and irregular. His blood soaked through her uniform, warm and urgent against her palms. She could feel his pulse weakening beneath her fingertips, could see the way his skin grew pale despite his naturally darker complexion. The gunfire ceased with shocking suddenness as Jin's reinforcements arrived, their coordinated assault eliminating the remaining attackers with professional efficiency. But Amara barely registered the sounds of combat resolution. Her entire focus concentrated on keeping Jin's heart beating while his security team secured the scene. Lieutenant Park Jungo knelt beside them, his face grim as he assessed his boss's condition. Jin's breathing had become barely perceptible, his body showing all the signs of severe blood loss and shock. Without Amara's quick intervention and medical knowledge, Park realized with cold certainty that they would be planning a funeral instead of a rescue. The compound's medical facility was equipped for exactly this type of emergency, but the 15-minute drive through Seoul's traffic-clogged streets stretched like an eternity. Amara maintained pressure on Jin's wounds while monitoring his vital signs, her hands steady despite the adrenaline that coursed through her system like fire. She had saved lives before during her clinical rotations, but never while bullets were still warm in the chamber of nearby guns. Jin's eyes fluttered open once during the ride, his gaze finding hers with surprising clarity given his condition. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that transcended their vastly different worlds. He had seen her choose to protect him when every rational thought should have sent her running toward safety. She had seen him take bullets meant for his men, had witnessed the loyalty that inspired such devotion from dangerous people. The medical team was waiting when they arrived, their efficiency suggesting this was not their first emergency extraction. As they wheeled Jin towards surgery, his fingers closed around Amara's wrist with surprising strength. His lips moved in what might have been thanks or might have been something else entirely, words lost in the controlled chaos of life-saving procedures. Amara stood in the sterile corridor afterward, her uniform stained with his blood, her hands still trembling from the adrenaline crash. She should have left then, should have called a cab and returned to her small apartment to pretend this night had never happened. Instead, she found herself settling into an uncomfortable plastic chair to wait, drawn by something she could not yet name to see this dangerous man survive the wounds he had taken protecting others. Consciousness returned to Jin woozing in fragments, like pieces of a shattered mirror slowly reassembling into coherent reflection. The antiseptic scent of the medical facility mixed with something warmer, more human. Sandalwood incense burned somewhere nearby, a deliberate choice to mask the clinical sterility that might remind him too much of vulnerability. His ribs protested with each breath, bandages pulling tight against sutured flesh where bullets had carved their temporary claim on his life. The first thing he saw was Amara Williams seated beside his bed, her dark hands gentle as she adjusted the foredrip that fed clear fluid into his system. She had changed from her blood-stained uniform into surgical scrubs that someone had provided, but her natural elegance transcended any clothing. Her movements held the practiced confidence of someone comfortable in medical settings, checking his pulse with the automatic competence that spoke of real training rather than basic first aid. "You stayed," he observed, his voice rougher than intended from the breathing tube they had recently removed. The words carried more weight than a simple statement of fact. In his world, people fled from violence, from association with men like him. Witnesses disappeared into new lives and assumed identities rather than risk becoming targets themselves. Amara met his gaze directly, unintimidated by the intensity that made hardened criminals look away. "Someone had to make sure you kept breathing," she replied with matter-of-fact simplicity that somehow carried more impact than any dramatic declaration. "Your medical team is excellent, but they needed someone who understood trauma response to monitor your recovery through the critical period." The admission revealed more than she perhaps intended. Jin's mind, already sharp despite the lingering effects of anesthesia, cataloged the implications of her knowledge. Pre-med training, clinical experience, the particular way she checked his pupils for signs of concussion. This was not the background he expected from a waitress at Seoul Garden, no matter how exclusive the clientele. Lieutenant Park Jungo entered with the silent efficiency that had made him invaluable for 15 years. His expression carried the particular tension that meant complications extended beyond Jin's physical recovery. The situation has developed beyond the immediate attack, he reported in Korean, assuming Amara would not understand the rapid flow of technical terms and street names that followed. But Jin watched her face carefully and caught the subtle tightening around her eyes that suggested comprehension. She understood enough to know that whatever Park was describing involved her directly. The intelligence was both impressive and dangerous in someone whose background they had not yet thoroughly investigated. Park's report painted a grim picture of escalating territorial warfare. The rival faction that had orchestrated the restaurant ambush was led by someone calling himself Dragon King, a theatrical pseudonym that masked ruthless strategic thinking. Security footage from 17 different angles had captured Amara's intervention during the attack. Her image was now circulating through networks that specialized in eliminating loose ends and potential witnesses. More concerning was what Park had discovered about Amara herself during the emergency background check. Marcus Williams, age 19, sophomore at Portland State University, studying engineering. Medical bills from their grandmother's extended illness had consumed the family savings and forced Amara to abandon her pre-med studies. She worked 3 jobs to cover Marcus's tuition while supporting herself in one of Seoul Garden's efficiency apartments reserved for staff. Jean absorbed this information while studying Amara's face. She had sacrificed her own medical career to ensure her brother could pursue his education, a devotion that resonated with someone who understood the weight of family obligation. The vulnerability of her situation was both obvious and exploitable, but something about her steady composure suggested she would not be easily manipulated through threats alone. Miss Williams, Jean said, switching to English with the formal courtesy that characterizes public interactions. I owe you a considerable debt. In my culture, such obligations carry specific responsibilities that extend beyond simple gratitude. Amara shifted in her chair, wariness replacing the clinical focus that had occupied her attention. I didn't save your life expecting payment, she replied with quiet dignity that commanded respect. People were dying, and I had the training to help. That's what decent human beings do for each other. The naivety of her worldview might have been charming if circumstances were different. Jean recognized the luxury of moral simplicity that came from never having to choose between competing loyalties or impossible alternatives. That innocence was about to be permanently complicated by realities that would not accommodate her idealistic perspective. Park cleared his throat and produced a tablet displaying surveillance images that told a story of immediate danger. Dragon King's organization had already identified her apartment building, her brother's dormitory, the coffee shop where she worked weekend mornings. Red circles marked potential sniper positions, escape routes, optimal locations for violent intimidation. The message was clear. Association with Jean had transformed her from invisible service worker in a high-value target. Your brother Marcus received a phone call 2 hours ago, Park reported with clinical detachment. Someone claiming to represent Student Financial Services asked detailed questions about his class schedule, dormitory security procedures, and weekend habits. The call originated from a number registered to a shell company with connections to our enemies. The color drained from Amara's face as the implications crystallized into terrifying clarity. Her hands clenched in her lap, knuckles standing out against dark skin as she fought to maintain composure. This was no longer about her own safety, but about protecting the person she had sacrificed everything to support. Jean watched her process the threat, seeing the exact moment when defiance replaced fear in her expression. She would not run, would not abandon her brother to face consequences for her actions. That loyalty, that stubborn courage that had driven her to shield a stranger with her own body, would now trap her in circumstances beyond her control or understanding. The solution I propose serves both our interests, Jean continued with a measured tone he used for business negotiations. You require protection that extends beyond yourself to include your brother. I require someone with medical training who can be trusted completely, someone whose life depends upon my continued survival. Amara's eyes narrowed as she recognized the shape of the cage being constructed around her. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked with careful neutrality that did not quite conceal her growing apprehension. "You become part of my household staff with specialized responsibilities for my health and recovery. You live here, in the compound, where my security can ensure your safety. In return, your brother's education is fully funded, your grandmother's medical debts eliminated, and both of you receive protection that guarantees your enemies cannot reach you." The offer was generous enough to seem almost philanthropic, but Amara was not naive enough to mistake calculated self-interest for charity. "And if I refuse?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Jin's expression remained impassive, but his words carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Then you and your brother will be dead within 48 hours, and I will be forced to find alternative arrangements for my medical care. Your heroism in saving my life will have accomplished nothing except ensuring you both die as symbols of misplaced courage." The brutal honesty was almost refreshing after a lifetime of polite euphemisms that disguised harsh realities. Amara appreciated that he did not insult her intelligence with false reassurances or pretend that she possessed choices she clearly did not have. The trap was elegantly constructed, but absolutely real, offering survival at the cost of independence. "How long would this arrangement last?" she asked, seeking some boundary to contain the scope of her captivity. "Until the current territorial disputes are resolved and you are no longer considered a security risk," Jean replied with bureaucratic vagueness that could mean months or years, depending on how conflict developed. Amara stood and walked to the room's single window, gazing out at manicured gardens that surrounded the medical facility like a beautiful prison. Beyond the decorative landscaping, she could see armed guards positioned at discrete intervals, their presence a reminder that this compound existed in a world governed by different rules than those she had always known. The luxury was undeniable. Marble floors, custom furniture, artwork that probably cost more than she had earned in her entire life. But beneath the aesthetic perfection lay an infrastructure designed for siege warfare, reinforced walls, and bulletproof glass that could withstand sustained assault. This was not a home, but a fortress, beautiful and impregnable and isolated from normal human contact. When she turned back to face Jean, her expression had settled into resolved acceptance tinged with defiant strength that impressed him despite himself. "I want my brother informed that I've accepted a Livian position with an international medical consultancy," she stated with calm authority. "He gets a full scholarship that covers everything, no questions asked, no conditions attached to his academic performance. And I want regular contact with him maintained through secure channels." Jean nodded, recognizing a negotiation conducted from a position of acknowledged weakness, but refusing to surrender entirely. "Agreed," he confirmed. "Park will arrange the scholarship and establish communication protocols that ensure your brother's safety while maintaining operational security." Amara Williams had just agreed to become his captive, but she had done so on her own terms with conditions that preserved her dignity and protected her primary loyalty. The transaction was complete, the cage locked, but Jean found himself oddly impressed by the grace with which she had accepted circumstances that would have broken lesser people. Park escorted her to the residential wing, where she would spend an indefinite period as Jin's personal medical attendant and unwilling prisoner. The apartment assigned to her was larger and more luxurious than anywhere she had ever lived, furnished with obvious care for comfort and aesthetic appeal. But the windows did not open, and the door could only be unlocked from the outside with proper authorization. As Jean settled back into medicated sleep, he reflected on the strange turn of events that had brought this remarkable woman into his closely guarded world. She had saved his life and now belonged to him by necessity, protected and imprisoned in equal measure. The arrangement satisfied his immediate security needs, but something about Amara Williams suggested that her presence would complicate his life in ways he had not yet begun to anticipate. The rhythm of captivity established itself with surprising efficiency over the following weeks. Amara discovered that imprisonment and luxury carried its own peculiar challenges, the golden cage no less confining for being beautiful. Each morning began at dawn with checking Jin's vital signs, monitoring his recovery from wounds that had come terrifyingly close to being fatal. His body healed with the stubborn determination of someone accustomed to surviving attempts on his life, but she insisted on maintaining medical protocols that ensured no complications went unnoticed. Jin proved to be a surprisingly compliant patient when his health was at stake, following her instructions with the same attention to detail he applied to business operations. He took prescribed medications without complaint, submitted to physical therapy sessions designed to restore full range of motion to his injured shoulder, and allowed her to change dressings with a trust that seemed at odds with his reputation for paranoid security measures. Their daily interactions revealed layers of personality that neither had expected to discover. Jin's morning routine included meditation in the compound's Zen garden, 20 minutes of absolute stillness that transformed his features from commanding authority to something approaching peaceful vulnerability. Amara found herself watching these sessions from her apartment window, fascinated by this glimpse of the man who existed beneath the armor of reputation and responsibility. The household staff treated Amara with respectful deference that reflected their understanding of her unique position. She was neither servant nor family member, but something unprecedented in Jin's carefully organized world. Cook Kim prepared meals that accommodated both her dietary preferences and Jin's recovery needs. The housekeeping team maintained her apartment with the same attention given to Jin's private quarters. Security personnel nodded politely when she passed, acknowledging her presence without the submissive bowing expected from traditional staff. Jin observed Amara's adaptation to his world with growing fascination. She moved through the compound's opulent spaces without being diminished by luxury she could never have imagined owning. Her natural grace remained unchanged, whether she wore the designer clothing that had been provided for her or the simple medical scrubs she preferred when monitoring his recovery. Most importantly, she never showed fear in his presence, meeting his gaze with steady composure that suggested she saw him as a man rather than a monster. The first crack in Jin's emotional armor appeared on a Tuesday afternoon when Lieutenant Park arrived with his 80-year-old daughter Minjun. The little girl had been injured during a playground accident that required stitches above her left eyebrow, and Park had brought her to the compound's medical facility rather than risk exposure at a public hospital. The child was terrified, crying inconsolably despite her father's attempts to comfort her with promises of ice cream and new toys. Jin appeared in the medical bay just as Amara was preparing the necessary supplies for wound care. His presence filled the room with commanding authority, but when he knelt beside the examination table to address Minjun directly, his voice transformed into something gentle and patient that Amara had never heard before. "The scary part is already over," he told the child in Korean, his tone warm with genuine affection. "Now we just need to clean up the mess so it heals properly. Would you like to help me count the stitches to make sure we do everything correctly?" Minjun's tears slowed as she focused on Jin's face, finding reassurance in his calm confidence. She nodded solemnly and began counting each stitch as Amara placed them with precise care. Jin maintained a steady stream of gentle conversation throughout the procedure, telling silly stories about bandages that thought they were superhero capes and antiseptic that worked like magic medicine to chase away infection. Amara watched this unexpected display of tenderness with growing amazement. The same hands that had killed 3 men during the restaurant ambush now held a frightened child with infinite patience. The voice that commanded absolute obedience from dangerous criminals now offered comfort with genuine warmth that made Minjun giggle despite her injury. After Park left with his daughter, newly bandaged and clutching a small stuffed animal that Jin had produced from somewhere in his office, Amara found herself studying Jin with fresh curiosity. The complexity of his character defied easy categorization into the simplistic labels of good or evil that had defined her previous understanding of morality. "You're wondering how I can be gentle with children while ordering the deaths of adults?" Jin observed with a perceptiveness that made him formidable in business negotiations. The question was inevitable once you began to see beyond the reputation. Amara considered her words carefully, understanding that honesty carried risks, but that lies would be more dangerous. "I'm wondering who you might have become under different circumstances," she replied with quiet thoughtfulness. "That tenderness didn't develop in a vacuum. Someone taught you how to comfort scared children." The admission seemed to surprise Jean, as if he had not expected her to recognize the humanity that existed beneath his carefully constructed public persona. His expression shifted from guarded assessment to something approaching vulnerability as memories surfaced that he rarely allowed conscious examination. "My grandmother raised me after my parents died," he revealed with reluctant honesty. "She ran a small clinic in Busan, treating everyone who needed help regardless of their ability to pay. I spent my childhood watching her comfort frightened patients with the same gentle patience I showed Minjun today." The revelation explained much about Jin's character. The unexpected medical knowledge that had impressed the emergency team, his instinctive trust in Amara's professional competence. Beneath the dangerous reputation lay someone who understood healing as well as violence, who had learned compassion before circumstances forced him to master brutality. Amara felt an unexpected surge of empathy for the boy who had lost his parents and learned to find safety in his grandmother's clinic. She recognized the particular loneliness that came from being responsible for others' well-being while having no one to depend upon for comfort or support. That isolation was something she understood intimately from her own experience, sacrificing personal dreams to ensure her brother's future. "My grandmother wanted me to become a doctor," she shared with matching vulnerability. "She died during my sophomore year of pre-med, right when Marcus was starting high school and needed stability more than I needed to fulfill her expectations. Sometimes I wonder if she would have been proud of the choices I made or disappointed that I gave up the career she sacrificed to make possible." Jean studied her face with new understanding, recognizing the weight of abandoned dreams and impossible choices that had shaped both their lives. They were products of different worlds and vastly different circumstances, but they shared the particular burden of people who had been forced to grow up too quickly and accept responsibility for others' survival. The moment of shared vulnerability was interrupted by Jin's afternoon physical therapy session, a routine that required careful monitoring to prevent range injury to his healing shoulder. Amara guided him through range of motion exercises designed to restore full mobility while avoiding strain on the sutured muscle tissue. Her hands were professional and impersonal as she manipulated his arm through prescribed movements, but the proximity created an awareness that neither could entirely ignore. Jean was accustomed to being touched only in violence or brief physical encounters that served immediate needs. The gentle competence of Amara's therapeutic touch was something entirely different, healing rather than harmful, given freely rather than purchased or demanded. Her fingers checking pulse points along his wrist sent warmth radiating through his system that had nothing to do with improved circulation. Amara tried to maintain clinical detachment, but found herself distracted by details that should have been irrelevant to medical assessment. The way Jin's breathing deepened when she worked on particularly tight muscles. The faint scent of sandalwood that clung to his skin despite the antiseptic environment of the medical bay. The controlled strength in his body that spoke of discipline and careful maintenance rather than casual vanity. The session concluded with both of them slightly breathless and hyper-aware of boundaries that had shifted subtly during the intimate requirements of rehabilitation. Jin's recovery was progressing ahead of schedule, his body responding to treatment with the same determination he applied to all challenges. Soon he would no longer require daily medical supervision, and Amara's role in his life would need redefinition that neither was ready to address. That evening brought visitors to the compound, senior members of Jin's organization who required briefings on territorial developments and strategic decisions that could not be delayed for complete recovery. Amara retreated to her apartment during these meetings, but the residential wing's acoustics carried fragments of conversation that revealed the scope of Jin's responsibilities and the deadly seriousness of decisions being made. When she emerged to prepare Jin's evening medications, She found the conference room empty except for him, surrounded by documents and maps that painted a picture of complex territorial negotiations. His expression carried the particular exhaustion that came from making choices where all alternatives carried unacceptable costs. Mr. Nakamura commented on the change in you since the attack, Park mentioned during his security briefing. He said you seem less willing to accept risks that might have been calculated acceptable before. Jean looked up from strategic assessments to find Amara watching him with quiet concern. The observation was accurate in ways that disturbed him. His decision-making process had indeed shifted since her arrival. Considerations of personal safety now weighed against responsibilities that extended beyond himself. The realization that someone's well-being depended entirely upon his survival had introduced variables that complicated previously straightforward calculations. Perhaps having someone monitor my health so closely has made me more aware of mortality, he replied with deliberate vagueness that did not acknowledge the deeper truth of Nakamura's observation. Amara approached the table where intelligence reports detailed threats against multiple operations under Jin's control. Her medical training included enough strategic thinking to recognize the systematic nature of attacks being coordinated against his interests. Someone was testing his defenses methodically, probing for weaknesses that could be exploited in a larger offensive. These coordinated strikes against your supply lines suggest whoever's targeting you has access to detailed operational intelligence, she observed with analytical clarity that impressed him. They're not random harassment, but systematic preparation for something bigger. Jean studied her assessment, recognizing accuracy that matched his own conclusions. Her observation confirmed suspicions about information leaks within his organization, security breaches that would require internal investigation and potentially deadly consequences for whoever was providing intelligence to enemies. The fact that she could read tactical situations with such clarity revealed capabilities that extended far beyond medical training. Amara Williams was proving to be far more intellectually formidable than her background as a waitress had suggested, her mind engaging with complex problems in ways that demonstrated natural strategic thinking. When she suggested modifications to security protocols that would make information gathering more difficult for potential infiltrators, Jean found himself listening with genuine attention rather than polite tolerance. Her recommendations showed understanding of both medical emergency procedures and basic tactical principles, a combination that produced insights his security team had missed. Later that night, as Jean prepared for sleep in quarters that felt less isolated since Amara's presence had introduced warmth into his carefully controlled environment, he reflected on the day's revelations. She had seen him comfort a frightened child and recognize the humanity that existed beneath his reputation. He had discovered intellectual capabilities in her that matched her courage and compassion. The recognition was mutual and increasingly dangerous to the emotional distance that made their arrangement psychologically sustainable. Unknown to either of them, surveillance photographs taken by long-range cameras had captured their interaction during the physical therapy session. Images that showed intimate proximity and obvious comfort with each other's presence were already being analyzed by intelligence specialists who understood the strategic value of emotional vulnerabilities in powerful men. The external world that had created their forced proximity was now preparing to exploit the connection that was developing between them, adding new layers of danger to circumstances that were already impossible. Recognition had transformed them from captor and captive into something approaching partners. But partnership in Jin's world carried deadly consequences that would soon demand choices neither was prepared to make. The surveillance photographs arrived on Jin's desk 3 weeks after they were taken, delivered through channels that suggested the security breach extended deeper into his organization than anyone had suspected. 8 high-resolution images captured moments of intimacy that transformed their professional medical relationship into something far more dangerous. Amara's hands guiding his arm through therapy exercises, her face close to his as she checked his pulse, the unmistakable body language of 2 people becoming increasingly aware of each other despite the circumstances that bound them together. Dragon King's message accompanied the photographs, written in the flowery language that masked brutal intentions behind poetic metaphors. "The black flower has taken root in your garden," it read in elegant Korean calligraphy. "Such delicate blooms require careful tending, lest they wither when exposed to harsh winds that sweep away all beauty from the world." Jean studied the images with the cold, analytical focus he applied to all security threats, but something hot and possessive burned in his chest as he recognized the violation these photographs represented. Someone had been watching Amara without his knowledge, cataloging her movements and documenting her importance to him with the methodical patience of professional intelligence gathering. The fact that enemies now understood her value made her exponentially more dangerous to protect and infinitely more critical to his emotional equilibrium. Lieutenant Park reviewed the surveillance timeline that accompanied the photographs, his expression grim as he traced the systematic nature of the intelligence operation. External observation posts had been established months before the restaurant attack, suggesting the entire incident had been orchestrated specifically to create this vulnerability. Dragon King had identified Jin's psychological weak points with surgical precision and engineered circumstances that would force him to develop emotional attachments that could be exploited. The medical appointment that had been scheduled for Amara's routine checkup became the testing ground for these new vulnerabilities. The visit to Dr. Yu's private clinic should have been simple routine care, but Jin's security instincts screamed warnings that something was fundamentally wrong with the day's operational parameters. Too many variables felt scripted, too many coincidences aligned to create optimal conditions for an ambush. Jin insisted on accompanying Amara personally rather than trusting her safety to his usual security detail, a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. His presence in the medical facility's waiting room created obvious complications for other patients who recognized his reputation, but he found the alternative of remaining uninformed about potential threats to her safety absolutely unacceptable. The attack came during Amara's examination, when she was most vulnerable and isolated from protective resources. 3 men entered through the clinic's emergency exit, their movements coordinated with military precision as they neutralized the building's minimal security and advanced toward the examination rooms. Jin's bodyguards responded instantly, but the attackers had planned for standard protective protocols and brought sufficient firepower to overwhelm routine defensive measures. Jin moved through the chaos with lethal efficiency that demonstrated why his reputation inspired such fear among competitors. His response to threats against Amara transcended professional obligations and entered territory that could only be described as obsessive protection. When a lead attacker reached for the examination room door, Jin eliminated him with close-range shots that painted the medical facility's sterile walls with evidence of absolute commitment to her safety. The remaining attackers found themselves facing someone who fought with desperate fury rather than calculated strategy. Jin exposed himself to unnecessary risks, accepting bullet grazes and contusions that could have been avoided if tactical thinking had not been overwhelmed by primal need to ensure Amara remained unharmed. His men watched with growing amazement as their normally cautious leader threw himself into danger with reckless determination that spoke of emotional involvement far beyond business interests. Amara emerged from the examination room to find the medical facility transformed into a crime scene, broken glass and blood evidence testifying to violence that had erupted around her without her knowledge. Jin stood amid the destruction, his expensive suit torn and stained, checking each body to ensure no remaining threats could materialize unexpectedly. The controlled fury in his movements spoke of barely contained emotion that had found expression through necessary violence. The drive back to the compound passed in loaded silence, both of them processing implications that extended far beyond the immediate attack. Jin's reaction had revealed the depth of his feelings to his entire organization, emotion that could be read as easily by enemies as by allies. Amara had seen him risk everything for her protection, witnessed devotion that transformed their arrangement from convenient necessity into something approaching partnership. That evening brought a phone call that bypassed all security measures and reached Amara directly in her private apartment. Dragon King's voice carried cultured authority tinged with amusement as he addressed her by name, demonstrating intimate knowledge of her personal history and current circumstances that chilled her despite the compound's robust climate control. "Miss Williams," he began with false courtesy that made his threat more rather than less terrifying. "Today's unpleasantness could have been avoided with better communication between us. I believe we can reach accommodation that serves everyone's interests without further violence." Amara gripped the phone with hands that trembled despite her efforts to maintain composure, understanding that this conversation would determine whether she lived as protected prisoner or died as collateral damage in conflicts she had never chosen to join. The fact that Dragon King could reach her despite Jin's security measures proved that nowhere was truly safe from consequences that had spiraled beyond her control. The terms he proposed were elegantly simple and absolutely impossible to accept. She would leave the compound within 72 hours, disappear from Jin's life completely, and relocate to a distant country where she could resume her previous existence under a new identity. In exchange, her brother would complete his education without interference, and Jin would be allowed to survive long enough to witness the systematic destruction of everything he had built. Refuse these generous terms, Dragon King continued with polite menace, and your brother dies first, followed by Jin, followed by everyone who has shown kindness to either of you. The compound's defenses are impressive, but not impregnable, and my patience with this romantic inconvenience has reached its natural conclusion. The call ended with no opportunity for negotiation or questions, leaving Amara staring at the phone while her world shifted around her like earthquake damage reshaping familiar landscapes. She had become the weakness that would destroy the man who had protected her, the vulnerability that enemies would exploit to tear down an empire and eliminate everyone associated with it. Sleep proved impossible that night as Amara wrestled with impossible mathematics of sacrifice and survival. Staying meant watching Jean die, protecting her while her brother became collateral damage in warfare she had precipitated through simple human decency. Leaving meant abandoning the man she had fallen in love with despite every logical argument against such dangerous emotion, accepting exile from the only place where she had felt truly valued and protected. The realization that she loved Jean Woozing struck her with devastating clarity somewhere around 3 in the morning, when exhausted defenses could no longer maintain the careful emotional distance she had constructed to survive their impossible situation. She loved his unexpected gentleness with frightened children, his unwavering protection of people who depended upon him, the vulnerability he revealed only in unguarded moments when he thought no one was watching. More than that, she loved the man he became in her presence, someone who laughed at her dry observations about compound politics and listened seriously when she offered strategic suggestions during security briefings. With her, he was not the dragon of soul, but simply someone who appreciated intelligent conversation and found peace in her company. The love was hopeless and dangerous and absolutely real, which made Dragon King's ultimatum a choice between her heart and everyone's survival. By dawn, Amara had reached the only conclusion that honor would allow. She composed a letter explaining her departure in terms that would spare Jin's pride, while making clear that her decision was final and irreversible. The compound's security protocols included procedures for emergency evacuation that could be activated without Jin's direct authorization, and she intended to use those procedures to disappear before he could stop her or demand explanations that would only make their separation more painful. Jean discovered her attempted escape when morning security briefings revealed anomalous activity in the residential wing's emergency systems. Surveillance footage showed Amara moving through evacuation routes with the purposeful efficiency of someone who had studied emergency procedures carefully and planned her departure with strategic thinking that impressed him even as it devastated his carefully controlled emotional equilibrium. He intercepted her at the compound's outer perimeter, where high walls and armed guards created barriers designed to keep threats out, but equally effective at preventing unauthorized departures. Amara stood beside the emergency exit she had been unable to breach, her bag packed with the few personal possessions that had accumulated during weeks of captivity that had somehow transformed into the closest thing to home she had known since childhood. The confrontation that followed stripped away months of careful emotional distance and exposed feelings that both had been desperately trying to deny. Jin's demand for explanation met Amara's stubborn refusal to endanger him further through her presence. Her insistence that leaving was the only way to protect everyone clashed with his absolute refusal to accept her sacrifice as solution to problems that were his responsibility to solve. "You think running away will save anyone?" he challenged with barely controlled fury that masked devastating fear of losing her. "Dragon King will kill you the moment you leave my protection, then eliminate your brother to ensure no loose ends remain. Your noble gesture accomplishes nothing except guaranteeing the deaths of everyone you claim to protect." Amara faced him with the quiet courage that had first attracted his attention, refusing to be intimidated by anger that she understood masked desperation rather than displeasure. "Staying here makes me the weapon they use to destroy you," she replied with steady conviction that broke his heart even as it demonstrated the strength he had fallen in love with. "Every day I remain gives them more leverage to force impossible choices between my safety and your survival." The argument continued until surveillance alarms indicated immediate external threats materializing around the compound's perimeter. Dragon King had grown tired of waiting for voluntary compliance and decided to eliminate all variables through direct assault designed to kill everyone within the defensive barriers. Intelligence reports counted at least 40 attackers positioned at strategic points, equipped with military-grade weapons and explosives sufficient to breach even the compound's reinforced construction. Jin's security team moved with practiced efficiency to implement defensive protocols that had been drilled countless times but never tested against determined assault by superior numbers. The compound transformed into fortress mode, blast shutters sealing windows while automated defense systems came online to provide covering fire for security personnel taking positions along carefully planned kill zones. Amara watched these preparations with growing horror as she realized that Dragon King had orchestrated this final confrontation specifically to force Jin into impossible tactical circumstances. Defending the compound while protecting her would divide his attention and resources in ways that made successful defense extremely unlikely. Her presence had indeed become the weakness that would destroy everything Jin had built and everyone he was responsible for protecting. Jin found her in the medical bay, checking supplies and preparing for casualties that would inevitably result from sustained combat. Her hands moved with automatic competence born of trauma training, but her face carried the particular pallor that accompanied recognition of approaching disaster. She understood tactical realities well enough to know that their chances of surviving coordinated assault by superior forces were minimal at best. "I should have let you leave when you asked," Jin admitted with quiet honesty that cost him considerable pride. "My selfishness in keeping you here has doomed us all to death that could have been avoided if I had been stronger than my own desires." Amara stopped her medical preparations to look at him directly, seeing past the composed exterior to the man who was preparing to die, protecting people he cared about. The situation had moved beyond questions of captivity or freedom in a territory where only absolute honesty remained relevant to their final conversations. "I stayed because I love you," she confessed with simple directness that eliminated all pretense between them. "Not because I had no choice, but because leaving felt like abandoning the only person who ever made me feel completely safe and valued. If we're going to die tonight, I want you to know that these weeks here have been the happiest of my life, even though they began with imprisonment." Jin crossed the medical bay in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms with desperate intensity that spoke of emotions too long suppressed by circumstances neither had controlled. When his lips found hers, the kiss carried months of accumulated longing and the particular sweetness that came from finally acknowledging feelings that had been growing stronger despite every logical reason to resist them. "I love you beyond reason or wisdom," he whispered against her mouth as automatic weapons fire erupted outside the medical facility's reinforced walls. "You have become everything I did not know I needed, and I would rather die beside you tonight than live forever knowing I failed to protect the only woman who ever saw past my reputation to find something worth loving." The compound's defensive systems engaged fully as Dragon King's assault reached maximum intensity, filling the night with sounds of modern warfare conducted at close quarters. But in the medical bay, two people who had found unexpected love in impossible circumstances held each other while the world exploded around them, finally honest about emotions that had transformed their forced proximity into something approaching salvation despite the deadly circumstances that were about to test whether love could triumph over overwhelming odds. The transformation of Gene Woozing from civilized businessman into lethal predator was swift and absolute, triggered by threats against the woman who had become essential to his existence. As Dragon King's assault reached full intensity, Gene shed every pretense of refined culture and became something that belonged to older, more violent centuries when survival required personal mastery of death-dealing skills. His coordination of defensive responses demonstrated strategic brilliance honed through years of territorial warfare, but the desperate edge to his commands revealed emotional stakes that transcended business calculations. Every order he issued prioritized Amara's protection above tactical advantages, resource conservation, or even the survival of his own men. The compound's defensive systems responded to his voice with mechanical precision, but the human elements of his security force recognized something unprecedented in their leader's behavior. Lieutenant Park coordinated sniper teams from the compound's elevated positions, while Gene moved through the building's reinforced corridors like a force of nature given human form. His weapon handling displayed competence that went far beyond routine familiarity, each shot placed with surgical accuracy that eliminated threats with minimal ammunition expenditure. The economy of his violence spoke of training that had been maintained through constant practice and refined through necessity. Amara established a field medical station in the compound's central hallway, positioning herself where she could provide immediate trauma care for wounded security personnel while remaining protected by overlapping defensive positions. Her hands worked with steady efficiency as bullets shattered windows and fragmentation grenades tested the building's structural integrity. The skill she had abandoned when family obligations forced her from medical school now served to keep Jin's people alive through sustained combat. The first casualties arrived within minutes of engagement. Security personnel with gunshot wounds that required immediate pressure and field stabilization to prevent shock while fighting continued around them. Amara moved between injured men with calm competence that impressed hardened fighters who had witnessed combat across multiple theaters. Her presence provided psychological stability that was nearly as valuable as her medical intervention. Jean appeared at her field station during brief lulls in enemy fire, checking her safety with the obsessive attention of someone whose world would collapse if anything happened to her. His face carried the particular intensity that came from fighting battles where personal stakes exceeded professional obligations. When he looked at her, something primitive and possessive burned in his expression that spoke of emotional territory being defended through violence. The tactical situation deteriorated when Dragon King's assault teams breached the compound's outer perimeter using explosive charges that overwhelmed defensive barriers through concentrated destruction. Armed intruders advanced through smoke-filled corridors with the methodical efficiency of professionals who had studied the compound's layout and prepared countermeasures for its defensive systems. The superior numbers and firepower that Dragon King commanded were beginning to tell against Jin's smaller but better positioned force. Amara noticed the sniper laser targeting Jin's position before his security team detected the external threat, her medical training having developed observational skills that caught the telltale red dot tracking across his chest as he coordinated defensive responses. Without thought for her own safety, she launched herself forward and drove him sideways just as the high-powered rifle discharged, the bullet missing his vital organs by inches and instead carving a painful but non-fatal furrow along his ribs. The quick thinking that saved Jin's life also revealed to his entire organization the depth of protective instincts that ran both directions in their relationship. His men watched with amazement as this woman who had been categorized as valuable prisoner demonstrated willingness to risk death to preserve their leader. The sacrifice redefined her status within their ranks from protected asset to respected partner who had earned inclusion through courage rather than circumstance. Jin's response to Amara's intervention was swift and devastating in its implications for Dragon King's assault strategy. Seeing her exposed to sniper fire triggered something primal that transformed his defensive posture into aggressive offense, designed to eliminate threats at their source rather than simply repelling attacks. He began hunting enemy positions with the single-minded focus of someone whose protective instincts had been activated beyond rational constraint. The systematic elimination of Dragon King's assault teams showcased tactical skills that explained how Jin had risen to control territory throughout Seoul despite fierce competition from established organizations. His movement through the compound's damaged sections displayed familiarity with urban combat that suggested military training before he entered criminal enterprises. Each enemy position was approached with calculated patience, then neutralized with explosive violence that left no survivors to report his methods or capabilities. Dragon King himself entered the compound during the final phase of assault, bringing personal reinforcements and advanced weaponry that demonstrated his determination to end Jin's interference permanently. The confrontation between the two leaders took place in the compound's main conference room, where strategic planning sessions had been conducted during months of territorial negotiations that had ultimately failed to prevent this violent resolution. The duel that followed was brief and utterly one-sided. Jin's fury at threats against Amara, lending savage efficiency to combat skills that had been refined through years of personal survival in environments where weakness meant death. Dragon King's reputation for ruthless cunning proved irrelevant against someone fighting with the desperate intensity of a man defending his reason for living. The final moments were brutal and definitive, establishing beyond doubt that Jin's protection extended to anyone who threatened what he cherished. Amara found Jin in the aftermath, standing amid the destruction that had once been an elegant conference room, his clothes torn and blood-stained from wounds that required immediate medical attention. The controlled fury that had driven him through systematic elimination of threats was slowly giving way to exhaustion and the particular vulnerability that followed extreme violence undertaken for emotional rather than tactical reasons. She guided him to a chair that had somehow survived the combat and began assessing injuries that ranged from superficial cuts to the significant laceration along his ribs where the sniper bullet had found its mark. Her hands worked with familiar competence, cleaning and dressing wounds while he sat quietly under her care. The intimacy of medical attention felt different now, weighted with mutual recognition of what they had risked and accomplished together. The compound's communication systems crackled with reports from security teams positioned throughout Seoul, confirming that Dragon King's organization had been systematically dismantled during the assault on Jin's headquarters. Coordinated strikes had eliminated enemy safe houses, financial networks, and operational bases with a precision that suggested months of preparation for this decisive confrontation. Jin's network extended far beyond what Amara had imagined, encompassing legitimate businesses and underground operations that spanned multiple countries. Lieutenant Park's situation reports revealed the true scope of power that Jin commanded when pressed to defend essential interests. Police departments that had been investigating his activities suddenly found their attention redirected toward other priorities. Rival organizations that might have moved to fill territorial vacuums left by Dragon King's destruction instead offered formal recognition of Jin's expanded authority. The Korean government's intelligence services delivered carefully worded statements acknowledging that certain criminal enterprises serve strategic national interests. Amara listened to these revelations while monitoring Jin's vital signs and ensuring his wounds were properly stabilized, beginning to understand that she had fallen in love with someone whose influence extended throughout every level of Korean society. The man who held her with gentle reverence commanded resources that could reshape entire industries, eliminate threats across multiple continents, and bend governmental policies to serve his objectives. When the last of Dragon King's assault teams had been confirmed eliminated and security protocols returned to normal operational status, Jean found himself alone with Amara in the medical bay, where their relationship had first developed beyond simple captor and captive. The compound around them bore scars from sustained combat, but the immediate threats that had justified her forced proximity no longer existed to complicate choices about their future together. "You're free to leave now," Jean told her with quiet honesty that cost him considerable emotional control. "Dragon King's organization has been eliminated completely. Your brother's safety is assured through multiple protective measures, and there are no remaining enemies who would target you for association with me. The contract that brought you here has been fulfilled." Amara continued checking the bandages that covered his various wounds, her hands steady despite the magnitude of the decision she was being asked to make. The freedom she had been offered was absolute and unconditional, backed by financial resources that would allow her to resume medical school anywhere in the world and complete the education that family obligations had forced her to abandon. The offer of freedom was genuine, but she had witnessed Jin's willingness to die rather than accept her loss, had seen him risk everything to ensure her safety despite tactical disadvantages that could have cost him his empire. The man who now offered her liberty had just systematically destroyed everyone who threatened her well-being, demonstrating devotion that transcended contractual obligations or business calculations. When she looked up from her medical tasks to meet his gaze directly, Jean saw something in her expression that made his heart stop beating for several long seconds. The decision she had reached required no verbal explanation, communicated instead through the steady resolve that had first attracted his attention in the restaurant during those terrible moments when bullets were flying and normal people were fleeing toward safety. "I'm not leaving," Amara stated with simple certainty that eliminated all ambiguity about her choice. "Not because I have no alternative, but because this is where I choose to be. With you. Building something together that's worth the risks we've survived to reach this moment." Jean pulled her into his arms with desperate relief that spoke of fears he had not allowed himself to acknowledge until the moment they were resolved in his favor. The woman who had saved his life and then chosen to remain in his dangerous world despite every opportunity to escape represented something he had never expected to possess. A partner who understood the costs of his life and decided he was worth those sacrifices. The compound's reconstruction would take months. The political ramifications of Dragon King's elimination would require careful management, and the integration of territorial gains would demand strategic planning that utilized every resource at Jin's disposal. But for the moment, none of those complications mattered compared to the simple reality that Amara Williams had chosen to stay, transforming their forced proximity into something approaching salvation through the alchemy of genuine love tested by impossible circumstances. 3 weeks after the compound's reconstruction was completed, Jean Woozing stood in the renovated conference room where Dragon King had met his end, holding documents that would transform Amara's status from protected guest to equal partner in every aspect of his life and business empire. The legal paperwork represented months of careful preparation, ensuring that her choice to remain would be formalized through structures that protected her interests regardless of what future circumstances might develop. The freedom he offered was absolute and unconditional, backed by financial resources that exceeded anything she could have imagined during her years struggling to support her brother's education while abandoning her own dreams. Swiss bank accounts, property deeds, and investment portfolios worth millions of dollars lay spread across the polished table, each document representing security that would last multiple lifetimes even if she chose never to see him again. Amara studied the paperwork with the analytical attention she applied to complex medical procedures, understanding that Jean was offering her something unprecedented in his carefully controlled world. Genuine choice uncomplicated by threats, obligations, or circumstances beyond her control. The man who had once trapped her through necessity was now ensuring she possessed every resource needed to build an independent life anywhere she desired. "You don't have to decide immediately," Jean said with quiet honesty that revealed how much her answer meant to him despite his attempts to appear detached from the outcome. "These resources are yours regardless of what you choose about us. Your brother's education is secured, your grandmother's debts eliminated, and there are no strings attached to financial arrangements that recognize the debt I owe for your intervention that night in the restaurant." The generosity was overwhelming, but Amara recognized something beyond mere gratitude in Jin's careful preparations for her potential departure. He had spent weeks ensuring that her choice would be made from a position of complete security rather than emotional dependency or practical necessity. The man who controlled territory throughout Seoul through calculated self-interest was offering her freedom because her happiness had become more important to him than his own desires. She set down the financial documents and moved to where Jean stood beside the rebuilt windows that looked out over gardens where armed guards maintained discreet security patrols. His posture carried the particular tension that accompanied vulnerability. Someone accustomed to controlling outcomes suddenly dependent upon decisions made by another person whose choice would determine his future emotional landscape. "When I stayed during the attack, it wasn't because I had nowhere else to go," Amara said with the directness that had first attracted his attention. "It was because I realized that being with you felt more like home than anywhere I had lived since childhood. These weeks have shown me a man who treats scared children with infinite patience, who risks everything to protect people he cares about, and who listens to my opinions even when they challenge his decisions." Jean turned to face her, seeing something in her expression that made his carefully controlled composure begin to crack around the edges. The woman who had saved his life and then chosen to remain despite multiple opportunities to leave was about to make a decision that would either fulfill his deepest hopes or confirm his worst fears about deserving happiness beyond what survival and power could provide. "I love who you become when you're with me," Amara continued with steady conviction that eliminated all ambiguity about her feelings. "Not the reputation or the resources, but the man who brings me coffee in the morning and asks about my dreams of returning to medical school. The person who shows me kindness without expecting anything in return except my company during quiet evenings when the business of running an empire allows you to simply exist as yourself." The admission broke through defenses that Jean had maintained since childhood, when his parents' death had taught him that loving people made them targets for enemies who understood how emotional attachments could be weaponized. Amara represented the vulnerability he had spent decades avoiding, but also the completion he had never allowed himself to imagine might be possible for someone whose hands were stained with necessary violence. "You transformed me from a weapon into a man," he confessed with raw honesty that revealed wounds that had been hidden beneath carefully constructed authority. "Before you, I existed to control territory and eliminate threats, moving through days without joy or peace or any connection to normal human emotions. Your presence taught me that survival without happiness is just a slower form of death, and I would rather spend 1 year loving you completely than 50 years protecting an empire that means nothing if it can't include you." The confession carried weight that went beyond romantic declaration into territory where two people recognized that they had found something worth the risks their love would inevitably require. Jin's world would always include dangers that could threaten anyone he cared about, but Amara had proven herself capable of surviving in that environment while maintaining the essential qualities that had attracted his devotion. When Jean knelt beside her chair and presented a ring that combined traditional Korean design elements with stones that reflected her own heritage, the proposal carried formal recognition of partnership rather than romantic fantasy disconnected from practical realities. The platinum band held sapphires and diamonds arranged in patterns that honored both their cultural backgrounds, creating something new from the combination of their different worlds. "Will you marry me as an equal partner in everything I am and everything I'm building?" he asked with vulnerability that cost him considerable pride. "Not as someone who needs my protection, but as the woman who makes me want to be worthy of the love you've chosen to give despite knowing exactly who I am and what that means. Amara's acceptance required no hesitation, the decision having been made weeks ago when she realized that freedom meant little without the person who had taught her what home could feel like. Yes, she replied with joy that illuminated her features and sent warmth spreading through Jin's chest like sunrise after endless night. But I have conditions that come with my agreement to become your wife and partner. The negotiations that followed were conducted with the serious attention that both applied to important contracts, establishing boundaries and expectations that would govern their marriage as equal partners rather than traditional roles that might diminish either of their strengths. Amara would return to medical school with Jin's full support, completing the education that family obligations had interrupted. Her skills would be utilized within his organization when medical expertise was required, but she would maintain independence in career decisions and professional development. Their wedding took place in the compound's gardens 6 months later, blending Korean traditions with elements that honored Amara's African-American heritage in ceremonies that reflected the fusion of their different backgrounds into something uniquely their own. Representatives from Jin's organization attended alongside Marcus Williams, who had flown in from college to witness his sister marry the man who had transformed from captor into family through circumstances that neither sibling could have imagined. The reception featured dishes that combined Korean and Southern American cuisines, music that moved between traditional and contemporary styles, and toasts delivered in multiple languages that reflected the international nature of Jin's business relationships. But the most meaningful moments were the quiet ones when Jin and Amara looked at each other across a crowded celebration and recognized the impossible journey that had brought them to this point. 2 years later, Amara graduated from Seoul National University's medical school with honors that reflected both her natural intelligence and the financial stability that allowed her to focus completely on academic excellence rather than working multiple jobs to survive. Jin attended the ceremony with pride that extended far beyond personal satisfaction into territory where her achievements became validation of decisions that had risked everything for love. Their home in the renovated compound balanced security requirements with domestic comfort, creating spaces where dangerous business could be conducted alongside normal family life. The medical clinic Amara established within the residential wing served both Jin's organization and the surrounding community, fulfilling her grandmother's dreams of healing others while ensuring that Jin's people received the best possible care when circumstances required medical intervention. The evening ritual that concluded each day found them in the garden where Jin once meditated alone, now sharing quiet conversations about everything from medical school challenges to strategic planning for territorial expansions. Amara's presence had transformed even business discussions into opportunities for intellectual partnership, her analytical mind providing insights that enhanced decision-making across every aspect of Jin's operations. As they sat together in the peaceful sanctuary they had created from what began as beautiful captivity, Jin reflected on the strange alchemy that had transformed forced proximity into chosen devotion. The woman beside him had saved his life, challenged his assumptions, and ultimately completed his transformation from isolated predator into someone capable of building rather than simply controlling. What stories resonate most deeply with your own experiences of unexpected love? Amara wondered aloud as they watched stars appear above gardens where armed guards maintained discreet patrols. Sometimes the most meaningful connections develop under circumstances we never could have planned or predicted, growing stronger because they survived impossible challenges that tested whether they were worth the risks required to protect them. Jin pulled her closer, breathing in the familiar scent that had become essential to his sense of home and safety. Their love story had begun with violence and threats, developed through proximity that neither had chosen, and culminated in partnership that had transformed them both into better versions of themselves. The future stretched ahead with certainty that whatever challenges arose, they would face them together as equals who had chosen each other from positions of strength rather than weakness. In the distance, Seoul's lights sparkled like earthbound stars across territory that Jean controlled through careful balance of force and diplomacy. But the empire that had once represented everything meaningful in his existence now served primarily as foundation for the life he shared with the woman who had taught him that true power lay not in commanding others, but in being worthy of love freely given by someone who understood exactly what that gift was worth.